of Earth biodiversity and its origin. These arrows show how things have evolved. And it's divided into 5 so-called kingdoms. And it recognizes that everything may have begun with unicellular microbes, but it still prioritizes the world that we can easily access through our senses. And it still makes it possible to think about humanities, the final destination of the branch animals and the branch that begins with the microbe. Those of you who've studied microbiology recently know that this map is largely obsolete now. This image misunderstands and misrepresents evolution, how the human being came about, and its relationship to other forms of life. I don't think that evolution can be properly imagined through the tree or depicted as a hierarchy. And there are a number of alternative images of biodiversity and evolution out there now. And although other models exist, this is a more common and more widely accepted understanding of what life on Earth looks like. And it's divided not into 5 kingdoms, but into 3 domains. You can see 2 closely clustered domains, bacteria and archaea. Both are unicellular organisms that lack a cell nucleus. And then you have the life form eukarya, and that's different because those cells have a nucleus, and also all of eukarya are organisms that depend on oxygen in one way or another. So where are the kingdoms that we see here? The plants and the fungi and the animals of this image here. It's this portion of this new map of biodiversity. And all the other branches here that are not within this square are protists of some sort, algae, but most of them are actually also microscopic, so we can't see them with the naked eye. So humanity has a visual access almost exclusively to this little square in the left-hand part of the figure. This is what we see of the living world, and it's a very marginal portion of what creation is like, in fact. I think this presents a much more daunting image of biodiversity. The human, despite the impact this animal is having on the rest of the planet at the moment, is peripheral when compared to the microbe. Martin J. Blaser, who's a major figure within the study of microbes today, writes this about microscopic life forms of our planet. If you were to gather them all up, all the microbes, not only would they outnumber all the mice, whales, humans, birds, insects, worms, and trees combined, indeed all of the visible life forms we are familiar with on Earth, they would outweigh them all as well. Invisible microbes comprise the sheer bulk of the Earth's biomass, more than the mammals and reptiles, all the fish in the sea, the forests. If we return to this image again, even this is limited, in fact, in that it does not show how closely aligned these 3 dominions are. They don't exist outside of each other, as in this picture, but within and around each other. Also, it doesn't show how genes are transferred. It suggests that it's still a linear process and a straight vertical process from the bottom up, as in the tree, but it's in fact also done horizontally and across domains. And this image from an article by Margaret McFall-Nagai, one of the most prolific voices of new microbiology, and she gets it from Kunin and Wolff, as you can see. You can see the 3 domains overlapping. There's constant exchange and contact, and these 3 domains inhabit each other and depend on each other. And humans are, just like cats, ants, or roses, as argued by late microbiologist Lynn Margulis, a system made up of a multitude of interdependent beings. She argued that we have to think of the human animal not simply as an individual, but as a precariously balanced ecosystem that consists of a multitude of microbes that sometimes threaten the health of the host, but which mostly provide absolutely essential services and also receive essential services from the host. And there are many, these microbes. Counting human cells, or cells at all, is mostly guesswork. It's difficult to count them, but the most recent such guesswork from 2016, an article by Sender et al., estimates that the human body contains about 30 trillion cells. And at the same time, it also contains about 39 trillion bacteria, meaning that the human consists of more bacterial cells than human cells. And out of the human cells, about 80% are in fact red blood cells. So what does this have to do with evolution? Homo sapiens, like all animals, has evolved together with these microbes. They've adapted to evolutionary challenges together. Evolution was not an individual struggle for survival, but a joint symbiotic process, Margulis contests. And Margulis' research provoked a great deal of consternation in the scientific community, but it's also encouraged a lot of new research and a new line of scientific inquiry. Scott Gilbert, Jan Sapp, and Alfred I. Tauber proposing a symbiotic view of life. We've never been individuals, that symbiosis is becoming a core principle of contemporary biology, and it is replacing an essentialist conception of individuality with a conception congruent with the larger systems approach, now pushing the life sciences in diverse directions. And thus, animals can no longer be considered individuals in any sense of classical biology. And with animals, of course, that includes the human being, the human animal. In any sense of classical biology, anatomical, developmental, physiological, immunological, genetic, or evolutionary. Our bodies must be understood as holobionts whose anatomical, physiological, immunological, and developmental functions evolved in shared relationships of different species. Reading about this process is absolutely fascinating. The way that humans depend on microbes and the role that microbes have played during evolution. And I just want to provide a few short examples here. Just like a child inherits its genome, its genetic makeup from its parents, it also inherits from the mother its microbiome, the bacteria that will make up the 39 trillion bacteria eventually. Children who are born in the traditional way through the birth canal receive their first microbiome from their mother as they are born. When the mother starts breastfeeding, the child will receive through the milk an additional dose of microbes. Also, part of the milk is designed not to feed the baby, but the microbiome, the bacteria inside the guts of the baby. And that will keep the baby healthy. And just as an aside, it must be said that the human microbiome is rarely healthy these days, due at least in part to poor diet that fail to feed the microbiome properly, and overuse of antibiotics that kills bacteria indiscriminately, and an excess of chemicals in the air and the drinking water, in food. A number of what has been referred to as 21st century illnesses have begun to appear, and these are acne, allergies, eczema, diabetes, even obesity and autism have started to appear as a result of this. Because we fail to properly pass essential bacteria onto our children, because the overuse of antibiotics is destroying the essential bacteria, and because we fail to feed bacteria that we need, we've given other bacteria the opportunity to colonize our bodies, and these bring on these illnesses. And this is one way in which the Anthropocene is actually taking place in our bodies now, as I stand here, as you sit there. Now, to return to the image of the human animal, not as an individual, but as a multi-species ecology, I believe that the encounter with this image is another moment when anthropocentrism stops making any form of sense. The anthropocentric position is untenable because it prevents us from understanding our actual relationship to visible and invisible life. And the failure to understand this is destined to result in the slow but inevitable collapse of the ecosystem that all life inhabits and the specific ecosystem that all human beings constitute. And this is where we are, of course. Life for visible and invisible organisms on this planet is made increasingly difficult. And this also erodes the possibility of life for the multispecies human animal. Resisting this erosion is a challenge that faces all life and all disciplines of human study, including the humanities. And with that, I want to move on to the third part of my talk. If anthropocentrism is in fact a recipe for disaster, other ways of thinking about the human and its relation to other animals must be made available and to other life in general. And Professor LaCapra has been involved in precisely making such thinking available. Another scholar that's interesting to look at is Donna Haraway, who's championed the post-human position since the 1980s. And Haraway has been particularly attentive to the work of Margulies and to Gilbert and to McFall-Nagai, and is communicating and conversing with it in her work, especially in her most recent text, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu. There she asks the reader to precisely remain in and embrace the troubling, complex, symbiotic world that humanity inhabits and that the human animal also is. Doing so, however, requires a genuine attempt to reinvent relations, to reinvent the world, and to imagine very different positions for the human within this reinvented world. Referring to all living things as critters, she writes, "Critters are at stake in each other in every mixing and turning of the terra and compost pile. We are compost, not post-human. We inhabit the homicities, not the humanities. Philosophically and materially, I am a compostist, not a post-humanist." And it's not entirely easy to read Haraway out of context, not even within context, in fact. But I think what she's saying is that that she wants to stress that she stresses how she understands herself as a mortal animal body before she's anything else. She describes herself and all beings as involved in a complex process of creation and of death, and again, recreation and regeneration, and that process precedes any understanding of herself as a humanist or a post-humanist. I think that is when we let go of the anthropocentric perspective and see ourselves as animals, as ecosystems, as compost even, as Haraway puts it, that we also become beings able to truly think about the damage done to the planet and to ourselves. If there's no position that only humans can inhabit, that exists outside of the biosphere, the violence that's done to this planet is also always done to the human species, as it's done to all species. In another interesting text, the Humanities and the Anthropocene, the crisis of an enduring Kantian fable, post-colonial scholar Dipesh Chakrabarty discusses this very problem. He argues, now that the moral and biological lives of the species Homo sapiens cannot any longer be disentangled from each other, one has to learn to have recourse to forms of thought that go beyond, but that do not discard, the human political. The connected stories of the evolution of this planet, of its climate, and of life on it cannot be told from any anthropocentric perspective. Haraway, so what he's asking for here also are new stories, right? New ways of talking and thinking about the world. And Haraway, in a recent article, also calls for new stories that address the Anthropocene by considering new natural history and that make non-anthropocentric positions possible. She writes, stories for living in the Anthropocene demand a certain suspension of ontologies and epistemologies, holding them lightly in favor of a more venturesome, experimental natural history. And to begin to conclude, contemporary film and literature have in fact long been telling stories like the ones that Chakrabarty and Haraway are calling for, stories that are very different from the narratives that center on the white male soldier that we looked at the beginning. Haraway likes to discuss the fiction of Ursula Le Guin to a great extent. She sadly passed away earlier this year. But there's also a new generation of novelists that pay a lot of attention to the multi-species body in the Anthropocene, and which are often considerably darker than even Le Guin. And I just want to touch on a few of these, or two of these. You find such stories only within certain genres. They're able to speculate outside conventional mores. And I think good examples include the Dialogy, The Girl with All the Gifts, and The Boy on the Bridge by M.R. Carey, and Jeff Vandermeer's influential Southern Reach trilogy. And you see those three books here as well. Both series have spawned interesting films too. These texts reimagine the human as a multi-species being that has emerged out of an interactive evolutionary process, unlike the standard Darwinian model. The result is a being that does not correspond to traditional notions of individuality, and that is connected in multiple and complicated ways to the world that surrounds it. In Carey's The Girl with All the Gifts, humanity has all but died out after a microscopic fungi has transformed most humans into voracious zombies. Some of the children struck with this fungal plague survive, however, and constitute thus a new hybrid form of human life that does want to feed off the traditional form of human life, but which still have much less militant aspirations and a much more organic relationship, both to the microbes that inhabit them and the ecology that surrounds them. Similarly, in the Southern Reach trilogy, an expanding phenomenon known as Area X transforms and even duplicates all life that enter it. And the story centers on the failed attempt by the US military to understand and contain this area and the transformation it brings. And these novels take place within severely damaged ecosystems, but they do not imagine a resolution to the story where humanity is able to address these catastrophes. Rather, they let humanity, within quotation marks, die out. In this way, they invent new forms of being that seeks to undo the very foundation of anthropocentrism. And they do this by producing alternatives to conventional humanity. And in this way, they also try to resist rebooting anthropocentrism as a force for good, as a force capable of restoring the biosphere to its proper state. And I want to conclude just by addressing that interesting and I think also depressing proposition or notion. So I want to briefly comment on this idea that humanity cannot, in fact, save the planet, as it were. And this is a central concern to Chakrabarty, who is deeply suspicious of the notion that mankind may not have been, but can become, again, the steward of the earth and set things right. He's writing, "We do not represent any point of culmination in the story of the planet." And he points out that the planet's deep pasts and futures are not amenable to human-centered political thought or action. And the realization that humanity may not be able to undo the damage that's been done to the planet, even to its own multi-species ecology, because it does not have the intellectual capacity to properly understand it, to properly be the stewards of the earth. Again, it is troubling. I don't think it means that we can escape responsibility. I don't think it means that we don't have a stake in trying to put out the fire that the Anthropocene is. Just like a tourist setting fire to a forest in Colorado can escape trying to put out the fire. Of course, that needs to be done, and we need to mobilize in order to be able to do so. However, if the attempt to help manage the destruction of the Anthropocene isn't merely going to be precisely a futile putting out of fires. I think that the way that we understand the role of the human being on the planet must first be thoroughly rethought. Even the notion that we are capable of taking care of the biosphere must be interrogated. So the object of this talk has been to demonstrate first that new research into biology makes anthropocentrism untenable, and then to discuss new humanities scholarship and new literature that create new models for understanding the human animal and its relationship to the planet and to the damage that's being done to it. These new models, I think, are capable of describing life not as a continuous struggle for survival, but as an interconnected journey across time and space and species. If life on this damaged planet is going to be able to continue to house the human animal, I think these models are a vitally important beginning. Thank you.
Well, the best moment comes now. Thank you, Dominick LaCapra. Thank you, Johan Höglund. We had two perfect examples of the Wittgensteinian proposition that was sich überhaupt sagen lässt, lässt sich klar sagen. So anything that can be said at all can be said clearly. And starting from critical theory and from biology, they both showed us how anthropocentrism is untenable and many other things. So open for questions. Anyone?
Do we have a big enough compost heap? Is that
a few seconds to elaborate because it was dense. Clear but dense.
I got a question that might stimulate other things. One problem with the idea that the problems that humans have created are probably not resolvable by humans, and certainly not through any traditional techniques such as political organization. That's conceivable. But what it may do also is to feed into what has existed for a long time, and that is a very strong apocalyptic tendency, that there has to be something like devastation, a devastating change that in a way we may bring about. Let's say, diacritics went through a zany phase of nuclear criticism. You had these various essays, and you should have seen some of the ones that were submitted, sort of praising the atom bomb as a sublime object that could be glorified. And it also, in a way, feeds into something from another end of the spectrum, end of days theology. And there was a person who was, I forget the guy's name, who was, worse than Pruitt at environmental protection, because he was an end of days Protestant theological type who really thought, why should we conserve anything? It's all going to end, and if we're lucky, relatively soon. So have it all